they said, 3 things will happen today. We are going to march. We will either march to the Selma courthouse, we will be jailed, or we will be beaten, but we will not turn back.
Selma was a humbling experience, but humbling because, as I've said over and over, the real heroes at Selma were the Selmans themselves, who took the very first step across the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
I understand that the massacre at the Pettus Bridge occurred, and there was a film on TV of the Nuremberg trials. And right after the film was over at about midnight, it showed this devastation, people being beaten and hosed and horses sitting on their chest. And so immediately the next day, the Catholic Interracial Council, National, put out a call for people of faith to come and be witness at Selma. And they contacted one of the very active priests in the city, Norman Roeder, and he called us, Judith and I, because we were working with him. And as far as our superiors letting us go, I think we caught a very lucky break. Sister Edwardine was out of town. I don't know what she would have said, but Kathleen Ty was the principal. And I went to Kathleen and said, in conscience, I just have to go to Selma. Judith and I just have to go to Selma. And Kathleen said, well, I guess if that's what your conscience says, you better go. So that's how we got to be there. We went with a group from the Catholic Interracial Council, made up of priests, nuns from other orders, women from the inner city, lay people, just a wonderful group. I was getting so involved in the inner city, and I was so disturbed by the injustices in the school systems in the inner city, in the housing. We had tons of homeless men that hung around that were living in vacant buildings in the inner city. So I guess with all that and being asked to do that, it was just an urgent cry. And the first urgent cry I had really ever heard to become an activist on the lines. And it's just something I had to do.
And I don't think any people who had seen that film of Bloody Sunday on the Edmund Pettus Bridge could not feel a twinge of conscience. They might not all have been called to go witness, but certainly everyone wanted to, even in their own little city, witness against not only the injustice of this, but the cruelty, the thoughtlessness, the treating of people like animals instead of the real humans that they were. So I think lots of people's consciences were pricked. Not all had the same opportunity that we had to go.
It was just before we were preparing for St. Patrick's Day, and Loretto Academy had a huge fundraiser for St. Patrick's for the missions. And all the classes competed to raise the most money. And all the kids were coming up congratulating me. And Janet Williams was a young Black woman. I believe she was a junior. And she came up and hugged me and said, "Oh, sister, please be careful." I guess that was the first I realized she was afraid for us, because she understood more than I certainly did about the danger. But I did experience some fear once I got there, but I don't think before leaving I did.
You're right. I don't think we thought about danger because, after all, we were white people. We were nuns. We were middle class. There was no way we would ever in our lives experience any kind of danger. Once we got there, you realized the seriousness of the issue, and you could see the troopers and the dogs and the billy clubs and the guns, and you knew that there was danger there that we had never seen before. Even, all of our work in the inner city, I never felt threatened. Maureen, I don't remember this entirely. I remember we were in like a gym or something with beds that they put out for us.
Yes, I remember it very well. We were sort of like a gym, and they were mattresses on the floor, and they were on both sides of the gym. And you had your floor mattress, and you had a folding chair.
Yeah, I do remember that. Yeah.
We had, and it was in the basement of Good Samaritan Hospital. And the sister told us if we had come a day earlier, we couldn't have stayed there because their hallways were full of mattresses, their chapel was full of mattresses. And I think the only reason they had mattresses for us was because those who had had their bones set and had now left their mattresses behind. So we got to have the basement at Good Sam's.
I have always admired C.T. Vivian, who was the speaker and the leader of our particular time there, because remember, Martin Luther King Jr. was not with us when we were at Selma. He was off trying to negotiate the opportunity to make a real march. But I was so impressed with him and his vision and oratory and his inspiration for us that he was certainly one of the major uh, speakers and members that I can recall.
And I would agree, Judith, with what you said about C.T. Vivian. And once in a while, I catch his name, and I'm just so full of gratitude for his inspiration. But in the training, yes, they did give speeches, but they also trained us. They said, it is totally nonviolent, and three things will happen today. We are going to march. We will either march to the Selma courthouse to try to vote, we will be jailed, or we will be beaten, but we will not turn back. And then we were trained, we looked the troopers eyeball to eyeball, and we do not let them, we resist anything they try to push us around, we hold firm. And then we practiced covering our heads with our hands and rolling into a ball. And I can remember them saying, remember, it's much better to break the bones in your hand than to break the bones in your head. So they did spend serious time teaching us how to protect our bodies. And that might have been the first little touch of fear I felt. I thought, this is real.
Yeah. I had exactly the same experience. Once they really showed us how to put forth nonviolent resistance, which we had known people had done since Gandhi's time and perhaps earlier, but here we are actually doing it. And the part of the, as you said, part of the nonviolent resistance was also not yelling things, not throwing things. We were simply to stand and resist. And it doesn't mean starting a riot. It doesn't mean destroying other people's things. It doesn't mean taking whatever you can. It means just standing firm on your issue. Well, we headed out. We marched in lines. They lined us up and got us going, arm in arm, hands crossed, because we figured that would build a better line of resistance, and headed out then to where the troopers were standing. And they didn't make any moves, nor did they, I don't recall any sniggering or untoward behavior on their part either, but there was certainly hostility. And they could probably feel the hostility from us, even though we were attempting to be as calm and understanding and non-judgmental as possible.
My recollection is very much the same. We were in one large line, and once we met the troopers, and there must have been, we were a lot of people. We must have been, there were 600 on the Pettus Bridge. There had to be at least a couple thousand by then. But I remember the whole thing being very orderly. I also remember we stood there forever, and it was a rainy day. It was somewhat chilly. And then all of a sudden, the troopers got an order to turn around, and we were looking at the back of their heads. Well, my God, we couldn't look eyeball to eyeball anymore. And I have been so grateful for the young people of Selma, because we stood there a long time, and they never stopped singing. They never stopped clapping. We shall overcome. We shall not be moved. I'm going to let Volcano turn us around. And somehow they just inspired the rest of us to act like teenagers too. Somehow we survived it until the next stage of the story. Do you want to hear it?
Yeah.
We stood there for quite a while, and we were confined to the projects. We never got outside of the projects, and they were low rises. They were 3 stories high. And all of a sudden, an elderly Black man shouted from the 3rd floor, his 3rd floor apartment, and he said, "The President of the United States just spoke, and he said, we shall pass the Voter Registration Act, and we shall overcome." So tremendous clapping went on, and C.T. Vivian saw that as a chance. We obviously weren't going to be arrested. We weren't going to be beaten. We weren't going to get to the courthouse. We might be still standing there today, 50 years later. So this was an excuse to go back and rethink our strategy. And now they decide, since the troopers won't even look at us, we will not march to the courthouse together. We will branch off in little groups of 20 or 30 people and go in all directions. And so we start our march again, and all of a sudden, some go north, some go south, east, west, northeast, southwest, you name it. And it was really kind of funny watching the troopers race around to try and catch up with us so they could stop us. And they did stop all of us except for one group. And in that group was a woman named Judith Dillon and about 19 other people, if I remember. But for those of us who heard about it, we were frantic because the Reverend Reeb had been beaten to death. And that was one reason they were being so protective of us. This was really serious. And here were this group of people, including some nuns in their long skirts, tripping along the streets of Selma to the courthouse all by themselves. Somehow, though, they apparently, CT and the rest caught up with them, and they were not murdered or beaten or jailed.
I don't think we were any more frightened at that point. I think we knew we had won. With the president speaking, with the troopers not being, we knew the troopers had to hold back because of the television cameras. I think had there not been television cameras, it could have all been a totally different story. And Reverend Reeb, I think, was beaten to death a few days previous. That was Tuesday night, and we got there Thursday or Friday, but nonetheless, that he hadn't even been buried. And there was concern. When we finally packed up to go home, I think we knew we had, something had passed. Yes, the Selmans could still not get across the bridge, but we knew things were going to be different, in Selma at least, going forward. I don't think we were worried about leaving them. And I think there were people who stayed on too, various groups that planned to stay on just for that purpose, to assure that there was safety for the Selma people over the next few weeks.
And I would add to that also this Catholic interracial call and calls from other churches and other people of caring and concern of whatever faith or no faith were continuing to come down.
Right.
So I think as we left, other people were replacing us who hadn't come yet.
Yeah. I've often said, Maureen, that you and I thought at the time that this was going to be the beginning of biracial smoothness in the United States, that the whole issue of race was about to be settled, that equality was on its way. And we even talked about biracial marriages, of what the future of the United States would look like in terms of we wouldn't be worried about color. And here we are in 2015, and we've just had a terrible situation in Ferguson. You and I both know from different work that we've done that it hasn't really taken place. However, we certainly thought at the time that this was going to be a big step.
And I would have to say the same. In a sense, I see the 60s and 70s as a time of such innocent hope. We really thought we were going to change the world. And I guess, it couldn't do anything but get better and better. And I was going to be a part of it. And I don't know if it's gotten better and better or not. It's always been a cruel world. It seems more cruel to me than any time I remember. But it was such a humbling experience. I mean, it was so life-changing for me. That the experience of Selma has certainly led us to choose to serve those who have never been given the breaks of the American dream. So with all this just there, I think there is hope, and I think Selma planted that seed of hope and guided our lives to be, in every way we could, useful for the good of our neighbor, our earth, our far-flung neighbor, our near neighbor, each other. Amen. Finish preaching.
I agree with you that Selma was a humbling experience, but humbling because, as I've said over and over, the real heroes at Selma were the Selmans themselves, who took the very first step across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And they didn't have any of the protections that we had, including our habits or our whiteness. They continued to be, the time we were there and the time after there, even to today, they continue to be the courageous people. We need to give some credit to the superiors who let us go, because we lost students at the academy as a result, because people thought it was wrong for us to do that. There were church people who thought it was absolutely wrong for sisters to be involving themselves in any of these issues. So I think credit needs to go to those superiors who let us do that, and then let us continue. Because after that, we continued for many years until we left the congregation to work at Brown's, to continue to work in the inner city and try to do those things. And I've also mentioned that I think TV was a big issue at that time. I think that was a turning point. Having the television there and having other people see what was going on in the South. We'd heard stories and we had read newspaper articles, but actually seeing people being beaten and then other people backing them up, and actually seeing nonviolent resistance. I think all of those things being on TV for people all around the United States, I think that made a difference. It was worth it to me personally, but also I do think it made a difference to have that many people backing up a small town in Alabama And I think whenever I run into African Americans and for some reason or another, they know that I marched in Selma, they are grateful. And that is humbling as well, because again, I think the real heroes there were the people in Selma themselves. Yes, in all of those senses, it was worth it. I think if you took that out of time and said, well, none of that ever happened, so many dominoes would not have fallen, including the Voting Rights Act, which was a big result of our being there. I mean, Martin Luther King had been asking for that for years, and so had Black people. You know, that'd been going on forever, but I think that pushed everybody over.
It was life changing. It it was worth it. What else can I say? It was, yes.